This program is made possible in part by Nebraskans for Public Television. Consider this, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bales Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome back to UNO. You know, you can't turn on any of the news networks right now without seeing at least one story an hour on a place that is important in history in this part of the world, Guantanamo Bay, and it's important in the history that's being made right now, certainly because the detainees captured in Afghanistan are being sent there, housed there until they're dispensed with one way or another. My guest this week is very familiar with that big island to the south of Florida. His name is Dr. Jonathan Benjamin Alvarado. Sounds like you have two first names. You are a UNO professor of political science. Your expertise is one kind of area of Cuban interest, but you don't limit yourself to this. Nuclear power, or the possibility of nuclear power down there.
I've spent a good number of years looking at energy development and energy issues, energy policy in Cuba, of which nuclear energy development is a part of that. But I've been traveling to Cuba for almost 10 years now on an annual basis. In the last few years, multiple times every year. In
fact, you were there after September 11th.
I was there in November and was welcomed by Hurricane Michelle.
Well, I suppose the rest of the people there were generally more friendly.
Well, very much so, very much so.
What, is it interesting to you that, you know, suddenly, there's the whole history of the United States relationship with Cuba, which is interesting in and of itself, but the new history that's being made, I mean, which doesn't necessarily directly affect Cuba, but there are certain waves that are coming out from their foreign relations, subtle changes, words.
Well, I would say that's more than subtle.
Probably.
You know, there was an article that appeared in the editorial section of the Washington Post a few days ago.
But that's not subtle then.
No. It stated that Cuba may become the United States' newest ally, inasmuch as the Cuban government has openly stated that it will not erect any obstacles to the detention of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda individuals who are now being sent to Guantanamo Bay. They also offered medical assistance in addition to providing logistical support such as sanitation and any other things that would be needed on the base by the Americans presently there. And so, you know, I mean, this is a dramatic shift from the position that the Cubans have held previously. And,
you know, other interesting things that are going on, if you do a news search on it, you see that Interpol congratulates Castro for his saying that he, you know, is sort of, not in these words, but joining the war on terrorism. In fact, they're going to outfit them with all kinds of software so they can input and extract information about possible terroristas that might be down there. And then, you know, the humanitarian, the small amounts of trade that are going on in terms of humanitarian food shipments, even though we, you know, commercially do not trade, allow trade.
You know, in the wake of Hurricane Michelle, you have to consider that the Cubans had over 5,000 structures destroyed. They received over 2 feet of rain in a 24-hour period, 130-mile-an-hour winds. The infrastructure of the farm belt within Cuba was essentially destroyed. And so it's going to be not a cold winter, but a brutal winter you know, under any scenario. And I think it was appropriate on the part of the United States to step forward and offer assistance to allow the Cubans to outright purchase foodstuffs for its population. And so in the past 2 weeks we've had in excess of 80 tons of food from companies such as ADM, Cargill, and ConAgra being shipped down to Cuba.
Yeah, that's been some of the local headlines if you flip on the news, that Nebraska or Iowa wheat is going down there, or corn. El Presidente, Fidel, such a huge figure. internationally at one time a much huger figure, but certainly in Cuba, I mean, presidents tend to dominate, but his charisma, his just his hold on the people of that country on many levels is, and he's getting old, but he still has the stuff.
The thing that's interesting about Fidel Castro, and I think what you just stated was the conventional wisdom that we've held for a number of years about his charismatic personality, his leadership skill, and all of that is true. But I think what we haven't taken into consideration in general in this country is that he's also changed quite a bit.
Okay, how? Because I think we still, and you know, there are many Cuban expatriates who are still just, I mean, the name Fidel makes their toes curl.
The thing that's interesting about Fidel Castro today is that, you know, one of the preconceived ideas about him is that he would never, ever give up 1 inch or iota of power on the island. And much to many people's surprise, he has been open about allowing others to make, you know, significant decisions on issues of its economy, on issues of its foreign relations, to the point where some people are arguing that there is already in place in Cuba a very well-trained and well-equipped cadre of individuals to lead the country after he's gone. And so this is something that's different. The other thing that's different about this is that you know, people believe that he was a staunch socialist, communist, that he would never give up on trying to, you know, create a Marxist world. But, you know, anybody who's been to Cuba understands that the de facto currency in Cuba today is the U.S. dollar.
Absolutely.
And Cuba lives and dies by the amount of dollars that get into its economy. And so this is yes, it's a concession to the end of the Cold War. It's a concession and an acknowledgement of the end of their relationship with the former Soviet Union. But, you know, I think that it also would force us to look at him much differently than we've looked at him and the Cuban government in the past.
There are some clear figures that I mean, we describe countries in ways just like we overly simplify our description of people. That, you know, about third world countries. In many respects, it is still considered a third world country in terms of the definitions of. But it is, it has what, 95% literacy rate?
Let me give you,
an
example. Let me give you an example, or just a sidebar on this to kind of illustrate this point for you. In the last 3 years, UNESCO has conducted tests of reading and math skills for 3rd and 4th graders throughout all of Latin America.
So Cuba, this isn't more independent
This is an independent assessment of primary education in Latin America. Across the board, Cubans in the 3rd and the 4th grade scored higher than every other country in Latin America, bar none. The thing that was so interesting about it, on average, they were about 40% higher than every country in Latin America. And so UNESCO, thinking that there may have been an error in its testing, went back and retested the Cubans. And that even the Cuban students in the 3rd and 4th grade today who are at the bottom of the scale still rank higher than the entire regional average. So this is a testament, I think, to the ability to marshal meager resources, because the country is not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but it also shows, I think, the kind of results when a government is firmly committed to education. Now, some people would quibble about the exact nature about what it is that they're reading. You know, that there might be some ideological
but aside, but raw reading skills.
Raw reading skills, there is no country as well equipped to engage the future than I think Cuba is right now. The highest per capita rate of PhDs to the general population of any country in the developing world. Ranks on par with countries like France, Japan. It's an incredible accomplishment for what I would term as a poor country.
So what does the future portend? I mean, you mentioned that Fidel has put together this cadre of individuals and are allowing them to, I guess, in a to run parts of the administration. In other words, department heads, kind of like, you know, administrators allow people under them to take departments, et cetera, here. And that we know his life is not infinite, that it is finite. Will it be after his death that we will begin to resume some sort of normal, or do you think something might happen before? What do you see?
Cuba's got a future with or without Fidel Castro. I think a lot of this now is contingent upon the ability of the United States as the primary actor in the dance that's going on right now of perhaps making some concessions. That being said, you know, there's no guarantee that that'll ever occur. Fidel's going to be 76 in August, but the actuarial table said he's going to live to be 87. So are we willing to wait 10 more years? Are we going to suspend animation that long to satisfy some of the political demands of some people in this country? I think the pressure is moving for us to act sooner than later. I think that what you see in Cuba today is an incredible upside, a potential that's not going to be enjoyed by any other country in the region because of the high levels of education, because of the high levels of the utilization of advanced technologies on a small scale in many places in Cuba. And yet, one of the things that's remarkable about the Cuban population today is that they understand where they are in relation to the rest of the world, and it's creating a pent-up demand for change inside the country also.
Well,
So
and
you've
many of them have relatives over here, so I mean, they know firsthand from, or at least from letters and phone and communication. So and they're so close, and so that different way of, not totally different, but that different way of life are those things that one would want to aspire to.
It goes beyond that, though. I mean, a lot of Cubans would say, I go, how do you get along? And in Spanish, they will say that I have the Spanish word fe, which means faith. Well, those two letters, F-E, also stand for familia extranjera, which means family outside the country, which is they're getting money from those families.
Oh, yeah.
So when they say that I
Dollars.
have fe, it means that they're getting support from outside the country, and actually remittances from abroad are the largest source of hard currency earnings for the Cuban government today. So were it not for the families living outside of Cuba, I think that the situation would be much, much worse than it is. And yet there is a growing demand and a clamoring for more opportunities, because now what you have in Cuba, you've legalized the dollar, you're creating a two-tier society, a society of people who have access to dollars and a society of people who don't have access to dollars.
Okay, that's a real climate, a real breeding ground for either suggestion for change or demand for change, or...
Well, but there's a reluctance on the part of the Cubans to change. And I think that if history tells us anything, and if what's gone on recently through all of Latin America and the Caribbean, the high levels of corruption because of narco trafficking, because of interstate conflict, rebel groups, paramilitary groups, the Cubans have been keen observers of what is going on around them. And I think that it's almost intentional on their part to move very, very slowly as to not upset the apple cart of domestic stability within Cuba by inviting in these other forces. I think the worst thing that could happen is if Cuba were to throw the gates open and then be overrun by criminal elements from outside of the country. And we know that they're all waiting and licking their chops because they see Cuba for the same way the United States sees Cuba today, as a strategic stronghold in the war against drugs. The drug dealers, on the other hand, would see Cuba as the perfect launching point for the distribution of drugs. So there is a battle, you know, on the horizon for Cuba. You know, which direction will it go? And one of the things that I'm hopeful of, that in this whole passage of events in Guantanamo Bay, is that the Cuban and American governments can put their heads together and begin cooperating more fully. This is going to require some deft diplomatic skill to have this occur. But on a case-by-case basis, the United States and Cuba are already cooperating in the war against drugs. Cuban Coast Guard have boarded ships and turned over the ship and all of its contraband to the United States Coast Guard and the United States Navy in the past. So there is precedent. There is a growing sense of optimism and detente at this point. between the United States and Cuba.
And yet the general public in this country, and not because I don't know what news they get in Cuba, although I would imagine there are various sources besides just, is that there's just kind of nada.
Well, one of the things that's occurring in addition to that is that there was a recent visit to Cuba by two conservative Republican senators. Senator Lincoln Chafee from Rhode Island was one of the senators. They had a 6.5-hour meeting with Fidel Castro. And when they came back to Washington, they reported that Fidel Castro is ready to cooperate with the United States on issues of terrorism and the war against drugs. Now, you know, if we're truly committed to both fighting terrorism and fighting drugs, that Cuba would seem to be a natural partner for the United States. That's going to take some incredible amount of political capital to make that become a reality.
And maybe some real capital to
And
make
some
that
real capital. But what I think is interesting about this, you never would have heard this 10 years ago. This never would have been discussed openly. There's even accusations from more conservative Cuban American legislators in Washington that something secret must be going on in order for this to be occurring. I don't think anything of the sort is happening, but I think it signals a change that's occurring in Washington. I think people are ready to move away from a 43-year failed experiment in attempting to isolate and economically strangle the Cuban government.
Well, and there is pressure from some of our allies that this has just gone on long enough.
Well, yes.
Now,
and
I
no.
don't know
I mean,
that really, well, at least there's lip service in the official.
But it doesn't really
pilot.
translate, because for a lot of those allies, it's better that we're not there. They get first dibs on what's going on in Cuba. The one thing that's remarkable about Cuba today is that you'll find Canadian banks and Mexican banks. You'll find French cars, Japanese cars. You'll find household products produced in every country except the United States. And so, you know, for those countries right now, it's expensive to trade with Cuba. Transportation costs are very high. And yet, you know, they understand if the market is opened up to the United States, that it's over in one fell swoop. You know,
And it's just, I mean, just the logistics is cheaper.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
I mean, it's a 45-minute flight from virtually any spot in the southeastern United States. It's an overnight trip by boat.
You know, my father did flight training at Guantanamo Bay, and many years ago. And he always talked about what an incredibly beautiful place. I mean, we always think those islands down there are all beautiful, and they are. But he had been to some of the other islands, and he just said it is truly. And of course, the people who have left Cuba say, you know, I mean, everyone says it is truly a beautiful place. I know it's full of poverty. There are a lot of poverty in places and everything, as many of the islands in that area. But what would Fidel want from us?
Well, there are some already pre-established conditions.
Do we have to mea culpa a few times?
For the formal normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba. One of them would be for the United States to leave Guantanamo Bay. Unfortunately, the way that the lease is structured, that's not going to occur anytime soon.
And that lease goes way back.
It goes back to 1903. And so, and the agreement is that the lease will remain intact until the United States decides that it no longer remains intact. And that's the way the lease is written. And the Cubans think, well, you know, this was written by an illegitimate Cuban government, and therefore it has no standing with us, but there's really nothing that they can do about it. That is one of the conditions. Another one of the conditions is that the United States lift the embargo, the economic embargo, against Cuba. And finally, that the United States stop meddling in Cuban affairs. Some people, well, how do they do that? Well, there is a demand on the part of the United States in law, in the Helms-Burton Law of 1996, that specifically states that the United States cannot have normal relations with Cuba until there is a democratically elected government. And the Cubans look at this as a meddling in their affairs. They say that the people there in Cuba are
Fidel or the people of Cuba?
Well, you know, the official organs of the state.
Okay.
Are the ones that make that statement. And, you know, the United States has used Guantanamo Bay for refresher training for all of its naval ships, including ships that carry nuclear warheads. And so this has always been a point of contention for the Cubans. We don't want this on our territory, and yet there's really nothing that they can do about it. You know, is there room for negotiation? I believe so. Does it occur in the next couple of years? I'm not certain, but like I said, I'm optimistic viewing what's occurred in the past 3 months alone. If you would have told somebody that we would be openly negotiating with the Cubans, or that they would be stepping up to the plate to provide support in our battle against the war on terrorism, I think somebody would have been pleasantly surprised at that point. And so things are changing.
But doesn't the Republicans, and we're in a Republican administration right now, have been traditionally have you know, had, let's just say the Cuban Americans have had the ear of the Republicans, especially those in Florida, which happens to be governed in the sense of governor by a Bush. Does that still, have they lost their clout, or is that still an important factor?
It's an important factor. I think it plays into the whole idea of intermestic politics, where you have
intermestic.
Yeah.
Is that a political science term?
Well, it's actually a journalistic term, where you have a blending of international and domestic politics. One of the things that's interesting about this is perhaps the Cuban Americans and the Cuban American National Foundation, its top lobbying organization, have lost a little bit of its clout. And it appears that even with a Republican administration right now, that there are other voices in the country that say, yes, we need to take into consideration, you know, the ideas and the thoughts of the Cuban American community, but they do not speak for the entire American people. And they can't hold an entire foreign policy hostage. And so there's cracks in that facade now. The fact that Republicans are going to Cuba and speaking with Fidel Castro, you know, people look back in history and also see that it was a Republican that led the détente with China in the form of Richard Nixon. This is not to suggest that President Bush will be visiting Havana anytime soon, but I think that there may be some room that for a Republican administration to do things that a Democratic administration can never do. One of the things that's not necessarily clear right now is whether or not the Cubans have the same kind of sway over the electoral politics of Florida as they claim to. I think that we still need some analysis of this last election to ascertain how much clout they really have now, because they're no longer the only Latin American group in South Florida. There's growing numbers of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and Nicaraguans and Costa Ricans who in some cases are supplanting the Cuban Americans. Not as wealthy, but definitely larger in numbers. And so there's a shift in demographics. A larger number of Mexicans in Florida, that it's going to make for more vibrant politics and election campaigns in the coming years there.
How does the Hispanic world, and that's a broad term, but let's say the other areas, the Caribbean and Latin America, how do they view, you know, do they have a preference? There's no kind of congregate or aggregate preference, but I mean, how do they look upon this Cuba-U.S. thing?
Well, virtually every Latin American country today now has formal relations with the Cuban government. Most of them have also concluded trade agreements with the Cuban government in a number of different areas. They have good diplomatic relations with the Cubans, and I think that they're hopeful that the United States itself will be drawn into that new change that's occurring. You know, Cuba no longer has any of the designs on becoming an international power as it did during the Soviet period, but what it has in mind now is to become a good neighbor. And to that effect, the Cubans have openly you know, invited medical students from around all the Latin American countries to educate them in medicine. It regularly sends physicians from its country overseas to practice in rural areas. The Cubans are actively educating people from Latin American countries in the hard sciences. It looks at itself as a leader in education, and not only for the Caribbean, but for all of Latin America. And I think that this is a role that it's well suited for. A long historical reputation for
Oh, yes,
good top quality
education.
education in the country. You know,
Many
out
of the people that left here, or that left Cuba for here, were already extremely well educated or on their way to being.
And the thing that's interesting about that, this is a really interesting historical artifact, is that many of the best and brightest people from Cuba came to this country to be educated. Going back to the early 1900s, that they've gone to places like Harvard and they've gone to our best engineering schools, and then they returned home and applied their education and their knowledge to bettering the Cuban society. Fidel certainly didn't create this legacy of education, but what he did do, and I have to give him credit for this, is that he expanded it to the whole of the population.
Well, that would certainly go along with the a communist Marxist kind of concept. That it
yeah, but he cannot complain. You know, he can't claim sole ownership of that, because it was something that was already there. In the same way that there was the practice of public health has now been expanded. I mean, there's always been good doctors in Cuba, and now it's that there's doctors everywhere in Cuba.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and since your area of expertise is sort of studying the energy situation, could you see in the future a partnership with some U.S. energy company in the near future?
You know, it's interesting that you would mention that. I've been doing the energy policy thing for almost 10 years now, and I've had a number of conversations with individuals from different energy companies and public utilities who are chomping at the bit to get down to Cuba. Many companies already have plans on the drawing board for the day that they're allowed to go down there and institute some programs. The Cubans, for their part, are working very, very hard to develop the technological expertise to address all of its energy issues with the components that it would import from the United States.
One being money.
One being money, but also the equipment.
The equipment, I mean.
And the financing, you know, I mean, so I think it's an area where we will probably see some movement in the future. The Canadians are already there doing it.
Well, you're going back in June to Cuba. I should mention that, you know, I wish I could have been first to grab you, but NBC Nightly News and World News Tonight and other PBS shows have, and we're sure glad you came here today.
Well, thank you very much, Carol.
Thanks for kind of giving us a feel for what's happening south of Florida. I want to thank you folks for joining us today and remind you that you can watch this show or any of our past shows archived on the internet. Go to UNO TV at unomaha.edu. I'll recommend it to your friends. This show and Dr. Benjamin Alvarado is a good time to start. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.
This program is made possible in part by Nebraskans for Public Television.